We're going to get to Puerto Rico in a second, but let's actually just touch briefly on you. You wrote a very good piece on one of the one of the main enemies of this show, and one of the main gurus of YouTube, Jordan Peterson, and you focus specifically on this talk of equality of opportunity versus outcome. Now, I have a lot of problems with that generally because it doesn't really mean anything when you drill down into it. And I think you can't really ensure a certain equality of opportunity without certain equalities of outcome, frankly. But that being said, I mean, you did a great job, and please elaborate on sort of, debunking the idea that we're in some type of collectivist moment. Obviously, that's just insane from a policy and reality and political perspective. But what do you make of, we spend so much time on the cultural resentments and the sort of contradictory politics that you just identified in the red states, that motivate some of the Republican base. I think there's an overlap, but the Jordan Peterson kind of audience is a bit different. There's a certain affluence to it, maybe. There's a certain self-helpedness to it. I guess maybe debunk his argument, but also why is it, do you think, that especially a time like this, when nothing could be further from the truth, that this argument is so resonant?
Yeah, well, Jordan Peterson is a complicated phenomenon, and I don't want to speak to all of it because a lot of different issues are wrapped up in that. But I do think that
emphasis on the word issues. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. This particular aspect of his thought, in the way that it's echoed by people like Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, the intellectual dark web, the existence of that term in our discourse. To me, I think that all reflects the fact that right of center intellectuals in the Trump era have a much easier time critiquing the extremely online left or than actually defending what's actually going on in the political economy and in the Trump administration. And right. They don't really have an argument for policies, but they do have some left-wing people who annoy them on Twitter, and they blow this up into a totalitarian ideology that they are bravely condemning every other week or every other day in the New York Times. And so I think that's the Peterson's thing shtick is a part of that. But the argument on piece is that Peterson, a lot of other people, they have this whole thing about railing against equality of outcome, and which is really a bizarre thing to spend your time arguing against at a time when America's economy is at Gilded Age levels of inequality. The average CEO makes 144 times the average worker. Black households have 12. White households own 12 times more wealth than the median black household, etc. But where it comes from is that there is this sort of pendantry about the gender wage gap. So progressives online will, present disparities, racial gender disparities, and present them as though they are tantamount to evidence of social injustice. And there's this resentment, connected to the James Damore thing, and from this segment of right-leaning STEM sort of men who are it's a fallacy to suggest that just because there aren't as many female engineers as male engineers, that this means that there is a gender discrimination. People can just have differences. There are biological differences between the sexes. The average man is taller than the average woman. Why couldn't the average man be more interested in engineering than the average woman? And from this, they extrapolate that the left isn't just interested in lessening gender inequalities in pay, but that actually philosophically they believe in equal outcomes, and they are committed to this totalitarian Marxist ideal of everybody in a just society would have exactly the same skills and qualities and money, which is totally baseless. What I point out in the article is that fundamentally this isn't an argument about equality of outcomes. I don't actually know any feminists who believe that as soon as we get rid of the patriarchy, there will be women starting at middle linebacker in the NFL. And I don't actually even know that many socialists who literally believe that after the revolution, we should have everybody having the exact same material goods. Most, I think, tend to believe that you need some sort of incentive structure to reward the people who, someone's got to clean the toilets after the revolution, and they better get rewarded, disproportionately from the people who are, whatever, podcasting.
Well, Eric, there is another scenario about who cleans the toilets after the revolution, and there's some sort of, slightly, I don't want to elaborate on that. I'll save that for my other show. But go ahead.
But the argument is really about quality of opportunity, and what the most progressives are doing when they suggest that the gender pay gap obviously reflects institutional sexism is they aren't necessarily saying that, like, in a perfect world, there would be exactly 50% male, 50% female in mechanical engineering or whatever, but that there are demonstrable biases throughout our society. We're living in a culture that until 1993, it was constitutionally allowed and it was legal in multiple states for men to rape their wives. They could not be prosecuted for that because once entering the marriage contract, they had full reign to their wives' body.
Right.
So, this is where we live, and there's plenty of empirical research demonstrating the way that the legacy of patriarchy affects and pervades, relations in the workplace. The, basic stuff like how, men will perceive that women are dominating a conversation when they're actually talking less than they are. Lots of stuff like this. And then, of course, there's the whole fundamental inequities in our system of, social reproduction, the amount of reproductive labor that women do in terms of housework, childcare that goes uncompensated, and that it's assumed that they will take care of, and that our entire economy relies on them performing that uncompensated work, et cetera. So, the situation is even more stark with race, which they, translated over to. But, it just
right.
kind of sort of.
Right. Yeah. Race is the next, and that's when you need to start bringing back, social Darwinism and pseudoscience. But I think that there's two just points that I just want to button on that briefly. I mean, one that's I think is actually really interesting is I think in some ways you could almost actually, really flip the tables on, especially, the sort of obsession with like kind of like gender orders and stuff like that, because you can actually say like, we won't really have any idea what aspect of the conversation is actually about, science or actual like gender differences until you've done so much work to overcome these biases, right? Like if you actually had overcome all of this and then people were sort of like without all of these impediments sort of like sorting themselves, then maybe we could actually make some very, very cautious claims that they want to claim now. We simply are nowhere near an environment enough to even sort of like sketch the surface of in terms of like, why somebody becomes a mechanical engineer, as you said. I think the second point though is that I guess when I say like certain outcomes, it's need to be ensured. Like, the sort of very obvious example, because a lot of times, at least when people get slightly concrete about equality of opportunity, and even these guys are not as direct on this either, but they'll say basically like, look, every single person needs to have access to a really high quality education. Well then, okay, but if you don't equalize, as an example, the tax base, so, tax funding is dealing from property taxes, and, then that's not going to work. And then in addition to that, if, two kids are going to school and they both have a great education, but one of them doesn't have food at home or health care, or their parents don't have health care, well, that's not going to work. So I think there are certain things that we could define as outcomes, like somebody never goes without food, healthcare, housing, really basic stuff that we have to ensure before we could even properly use this equality of opportunity term to begin with, because, it just sort of, it means nothing in the absence of those, sort of basic and obvious things.
Yeah, I think it's used to fundamentally just assert without an argument that, if there isn't a jure discrimination, then you have equal opportunity. The Civil Rights Act passed, so stop complaining.
Right.
Which is, even the most, like, even if you wanted to extract away all social conditions, like growing up in poverty, we have the science now, exposure to lead pipes, exposure to insecurity in your family, changes your cognitive ability immediately. So, and it changes your gene expression.
Yep.
even. So like genetics cannot be separated from environment. Or even that can't be. So the most basic idea, who you are is fundamentally determined by the distribution of resources in your society to a significant degree. And this is the kind of stuff that these very scientific-minded right wingers will not engage with.
You're a collectivist.